I'm back. So I think I left off that the U.S. had just declared war on Britain, and this is obviously embarrassing for the British Parliament, because you just signed legislation and sent it over to Washington to try to establish peace and create some boundaries, try to make the U.S. a little less antagonistic towards your country, which is currently fighting the greater threat, which is France under Napoleon. And right now they were very bogged down in the Peninsular campaign. Peninsula. You know, Spain, Portugal. So they also see an opportunity in it. The U.S. Navy was gaining some traction. They were becoming larger, better trained, better equipped over time as wealth and commerce were also developing. So they said, hey, we can kind of subdue the United States. We can maybe influence them to restrict their trade with France. And we can show them who's boss. Maybe we can set up those buffer states that we've always wanted. So the British get the idea that they are going to conquer U.S. territory. Simultaneously, the Americans have always kind of wanted, or at least at this time, wanted Canada as their own. They didn't get it in the Revolution. And something that most people don't know is that a lot of people in the territory that the U.S. wanted, which is Ontario, a lot of them were Americans. They were born in New England or Virginia, and they left because they were loyalists. So the war starts, and the U.S. invades Canada, and they actually capture town York, which is now Toronto, and they raze it to the ground. And eventually they're defeated. But this is concerning enough to the British, who don't want sort of these ragtag Americans leading these little raids into Canadian territory, which is obviously part of the British Empire at the time. So as soon as the Peninsular Campaign is done and Napoleon's no longer threatening Spanish sovereignty, they send their troops under General Robert Ross, who had been a very effective commander in Spain at the time. They send him to Bermuda. They really need to set up a crosswalk there. Actually, there's one down there. I don't know why. You have children. Just use that. Anyway. They send them to Bermuda to re-equip, rearm. And then they send them to Maryland, right here. Right around here. They landed, like a little south of the town we're in now, which is Annapolis. And here's something where the Canadians take credit where it's not really due. Yes, the Canadians had good militiamen. They have a name for it, Roy something boys, or I'm sorry to anyone from Canada who's watching, but I don't remember the name of it. But they effectively had a militia group that proved effective against the Americans. You know, they stopped and repelled the American invaders. But a lot of Canadians take credit for the burning of Washington, and that was neither under Canadian command nor was it executed by Canadian troops. They were British. Where the Canadians get that from, I'll get into shortly. So Robert Ross leads his troops south, and partially in order to humiliate the young United States, they march on Washington. They burn the White House, the Library of Congress, the early Capitol building, and then they march on Baltimore. And this is where Maryland really comes into play. This is one of the reasons they're so proud of the War of 1812, because it's at the Battle of Baltimore where the British are kicked out. General Robert Ross is shot by an 18 or 19-year-old, depending on which version of history you like. Shot in the chest. He dies there. And after that, the bombardment of Fort McHenry fails. the American defending troops managed to hold out against the Royal Navy. And naturally, because General Ross is now dead, the assault by land on Baltimore fails. So those troops withdraw. Parts of them will go to New Orleans, where they'll be defeated by an outspoken general by the name of Andrew Jackson. Of course, he later becomes president and for a time is on the $20 bill before he's recently replaced by Harriet Tubman. And another funny thing about the War of 1812 is that the Battle of New Orleans is fought after the war is over. Neither party knew the war was over because, once again, this is before smartphones, this is before communication was readily available through satellites and cables and all this fun stuff that we take for granted today. Nonetheless, the British get something handed to them there that they would rather not have. However, a lot of those troops that fought at Baltimore and were forced to withdraw following the battle head to Nova Scotia. And they kind of settled there for a while, and I'm sure that some Canadians maybe are even descended from them, but from what I've read, they were also eventually sent back to Britain. So the Canadians don't really have a claim on burning Washington. I've heard the excuse that, well, we were part of the British Empire, so we did it through that. But that's kind of a weak argument, I think. That's sort of like the Americans taking credit for winning the English Civil War. Interestingly enough, the parts of the Third English Civil War between Oliver Cromwell and King Charles II were fought about 2 miles from here on the Severn River. It was called the Battle of Annapolis. It occurred on what is now Eastport, around what is now Eastport, I should say. And it's one of those crazy things in history where we don't really think about, the English Civil War, what was going on in the colonies, but all those ideas, all those manifestations of representation were already happening over here, and they were happening to the same degree, just on a smaller scale, that they were occurring to in England. I'm a little worried because I think I may have been speeding a tad. There's a speed box right there. It's caught me a few times on my car. Bike's been lucky so far. Now, the Americans did have some impressive victories, especially along the Great Lakes, naval victories, and that's a big deal when you're fighting Britain. And then both sides signed the Treaty of Ghent in Belgium, and the war's over. What did each side gain? Nothing, really. And I mean, nothing. So why do we remember it? Both sides of victories. Well, for the Canadians, it's about resistance. Canada's nowhere nearly as populated as the United States. Fewer natural resources at the time. They had furs, but they weren't really able to grow as much agriculturally and export as much. So it's the idea of facing off against a larger force and not being conquered. The U.S. would have loved to have captured Canada, not necessarily to claim it, because Manifest Destiny doesn't really kick in fully until after the war is fought. As soon as the war's over, two things happen to each side. Both claim victory, even though the war's clearly a stalemate. Canada gets a sense of national pride. To this day, the War of 1812 is something of Canadian nationalism, if you will. And to the U.S., a bit of a lesser extent, but Americans see it as taking on the great British Empire and doing quite well, beating them at New Orleans, at Baltimore, beating them along the Great Lakes. And both sides are very pleased with that. And both sides ignore the losses. The Canadians and British won't bring up the Battle of Baltimore, among other victories, especially Battle of Tippecanoe, led by William Henry Harrison. Runs under the campaign even Tippecanoe and Tyler too, Tyler being his vice president, who becomes president following William Harrison's very rapid death, allegedly because he didn't wear a coat on a cold day during his inauguration. But Americans don't like stalemates. Americans like winning. Even today, you can think about the Vietnam War. And something that comes to mind is that a lot of people will bring up the fact that the Americans were certainly the dominant military power throughout the conflict. They were never really militarily threatened by either North Vietnam or the Viet Cong. It was just sort of a pinprick constantly hitting in the neck of the U.S. government. And it affected the U.S. politically. And I would say that politically we did lose that war. But it's probably best summed up that during the Paris peace talks, that doesn't sound good, regarding a final treaty and withdrawal of U.S. troops during the Vietnam War, an American colonel, whose last name began with an S, I can't think of it now, at one point stopped a North Vietnamese general by the name of Giap, and he says, "You know, you never defeated us in battle." Giap stops and thinks for a moment, says, "That's very true, but it's also irrelevant." Americans just do not like to lose. You know, it's like in the beginning of the movie Patton. General Patton says, Americans love a winner, and Americans hate the loser. And even if we're not losing, like the War of 1812, we don't want to admit that we didn't win it either. And maybe there's a bit of that going along in Canada as well. I don't think Canadians like to lose either. I don't think anyone likes to lose. But even today, part of staving off and keeping a separate identity from the United States is an important part of the Canadian culture. You know, I've heard it said that Canadians are more like Americans than they like to admit, and less like Americans than Americans think. And that's probably true. But both of these sides had parts of their identities formed from this conflict. It was the last time that the United States really tried to invade Canada. We had sort of skirmishes, you know, as we expanded westward. And that westward expansion was certainly influenced by the war, because as soon as the war is over, it launches in America what's called the Era of Good Feelings. And that's the period of time in which there was a lot of patriotism that was spawned by the war, even though during the war there was a large degree of protest against it. It was called Mr. Madison's War, James Madison having been the president at the time of the war. And it's following this that we really start looking westward. We start saying, hey, we are this great upcoming nation, and we need more land. And it's from that the U.S. begins to settle out west and in areas occupied by the natives. This is certainly part of Manifest Destiny. And it's very interesting to consider, because without that war, maybe the British would have been successful in establishing a buffer state. Maybe the world would look very different today. Maybe there would still be a Native American, a proper Native American sovereign state, influenced, no doubt, by British government and military, and all of history would be different. But for better or worse, the Americans were able to stave off British invasion, and the Canadians were able to stave off American. Both sides achieving very little, apart from developing their identities a bit further. That's about all there is to say, from a motorcycle anyway, about the War of 1812. Beep. This is really one of those fascinating endpoints in history. Today, a lot of people just see it as a sideshow to the Napoleonic conflicts. That would also end around 1815 with the Battle of Waterloo. But I don't know, because if you think about it, is something that is so vital to the identity of two nations really a sideshow? I suppose in the grand scheme of things, yes. At least from a European perspective. But from an American and Canadian one, no. It was a vital point and a victory for each side.